on 10:30, so let's get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Nicola Foote. I'm the Vice Dean of Barrett the Honors College here at ASU, and it is my very great privilege to welcome you all to round 2 of the 2021 Regents Cup competition. And as you all know, this is an opportunity to engage in an Oxford-style debate on a topic related to free speech. The prompts that the students will be discussing today is as follows. Legislation should be passed to disallow social media companies from banning users based on political viewpoints. First of all, I'm going to explain to you how the phases of the debate work, and then I'm going to introduce our judges and ask our students to introduce themselves. So there are 3 rounds in this style of debate. In the first round, we will hear opening statements presented by one student from each team. We'll start with the affirmative team, and then we'll move to the negative team. In the second round, the teams will engage in cross-examinations. And this is an opportunity for the students to answer questions from each other and also from the moderator. And judges, you may ask questions, but you have to do that via me in the chat. You can't ask your questions directly. And then in the final round, one member from each team will present closing statements. At the conclusion of the debate, our judges, who have all received training on how to score Oxford-style debate, will complete their scores. And judges, just a reminder that you should have a link to your scorecard in the email that you received onboarding you for this event from Chris. And we will then post results of this round and the first round following completion of all of the second round debates, and you'll be able to find these on the Regents Cup webpage. Now I'd like to introduce you to our judges, and we have an extraordinarily esteemed panel today, so we're very, very privileged to have them here. First of all, we have Mike Carney, who is Senior Vice President of Emerging Issues in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for being here. We also have Gretchen Conger, Deputy Chief of Staff for the Governor of Arizona. Hello, Gretchen. Thank you for being here. And finally, we have Doug Weiser from the University of Miami Board of Trustees. Hello, Doug. Thank you for being here. So thank you to our judges for giving up time today to support students and to support free speech. Please remember that you should be objective and unbiased as you listen and score the round today, and your score should reflect who you think made the better argument. So now, students, can I ask you to briefly introduce yourselves? Remember not to give your affiliation, just your name and perhaps your major. So we'll start with you, Benna.
Hi, my name's Benna. I'm currently a data science major, and I'm a sophomore.
Hello, welcome. Pavas?
Hi, my name is Pavas. I'm an English and economics double major and a minor in philosophy.
Fabulous. Alicia?
Hi, my name is Alicia. I'm a biomed major.
Fantastic. And Whitney?
Hi, my name is Whitney. I'm a graduate student in interdisciplinary health.
Fantastic. Well, look at this range of majors. You really represent what's really special about the Regents Cup. We're exploring things from a range of perspectives. Now, students, before we begin, please remember that this is a timed debate. You will have a maximum of 7 minutes for opening statements. We'll spend 30 minutes on cross-examinations and then 5 minutes for closing statements. And it will be timed, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning. Okay, so let's start with our opening statements, and we'll start with our affirmative team. I'm just setting the timer here. So over to you, team 1. Lead us off.
That's the affirmative, yes. All right. All right, we affirm that legislation should be passed to disallow social media companies from banning users based on political viewpoints. We observe that this legislation would protect user speech regarding political viewpoints, but would not protect users who incite violence or target a person with hateful speech. Take Twitter's ban of President Donald Trump. According to Van Bierken of the Reason Foundation, Twitter feared its platform might be used to mobilize rioters and that a continuation of Trump's rhetoric could lead to more violence. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey followed up with a thread where he tweeted, "I believe that this was the right decision for Twitter. We face an extraordinary and untenable circumstance, forcing us to focus all of our actions on public safety. Offline harm as a result of online speech is demonstrably real and what drives our policy and enforcement above all. This banning was due to inciting speech and threats to public safety, not because of political ideology." According to the New York Times, both Twitter and Facebook had spent years defending Mr. Trump's continued presence on their platforms before their bans of President Trump. Thus, these bannings would still occur. This resolution is useful for two reasons. And the first is that it makes people feel like their free speech is protected. People aren't necessarily even being banned for political opinions in the status quo, other than for reasons we'll get to in further down the case. They're typically banned for inciting violence or targeting a person. This leads to resentment for popular social media platforms like Twitter if people are banned for political views. After Trump was banned on Twitter, some users moved to a more conservative social media platform like Parler during the post-Capitol riots. It was worrying to see the president removed from social media, especially for activists, protests, and others. Under this resolution, Trump would still be banned, but there would be greater assurance that this is an action taken in protection of public safety. People then know that they have protection under the law, that their First Amendment rights will be protected as long as they stay on Twitter, and that these actions taken are to ensure public safety, not to dilute people's political ideas. Additionally, it would force Twitter and other social media companies to be more careful about removing bots by targeting certain political trends. According to Wired UK in 2018, Twitter has been struggling to clean up its platform since 2016, when allegations of bot interference in elections, as well as enabling harassment and abuse of individuals, embroiled the social network in controversy. But Twitter's attempt to clamp down on disinformation and propaganda is seemingly catching out legitimate accounts too. Members of the Occupy movement claim that Twitter is banning people for the crime of speaking to each other. Its latest crackdown follows on Facebook, announcing last week that it would be taking aggressive action against inauthentic activity, including bots and fake accounts. This leads to people leaving these apps because they're being unfairly targeted for their political opinions because Twitter and Facebook think that they're bots. When this happens, people are first just clearly banned and have to move towards other sites like Parler, where there's really just a lot of the same information that you're hearing from all other different sources. But second, people just think that they don't have protection and that this thing can happen to them as well, and they'll live in fear to move to other social media sites. The impact of this is more social media sites that target specific political groups like Parler. These offshoots are severe filter bubbles, as are the main sites like Twitter, especially when people leave because they think their political opinion is being targeted specifically. According to Schiffer of The Verge, a filter bubble occurs when users' social media feeds show mostly people's news that confirms users' prior beliefs, encouraging confirmation bias, partisanship, and tribalism. According to Alrid of The Medium, Fraser argues that the negative effects of filter bubbles are damaging democracy as a whole. Democracy is based off of the entire population helping to make decisions, and it gives power to the people by emphasizing the majority. Our second reason that this resolution is harmful, or that you should affirm this resolution, is because this resolution protects political groups on social media, specifically minority groups. Van Buren continues, "It's extremely concerning as to how much power social media has to silence any voice it pleases. As the ACLU Senior Legislative Counsel Kate Ruan put it, President Trump can turn to his press team or Fox News to communicate with the public, but others, like many Black, Brown, and LGBTQ activists who have been censored by social media companies, will not have that luxury. It's our hope that these companies will apply their rules transparently to everyone. This resolution would add greater protection and assurance that certain voices will not be silenced and deplatformed on both sides of the political spectrum. According to Kevin Roos, Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Zuckerberg's names have never appeared on a ballot. but they have a kind of authority that no elected official on earth can claim. This power appears mostly in subtle and in unspoken ways, like the eerily calm hostage-like video Mr. Trump filmed on Thursday, hours before and after Facebook and Twitter threatened to delete his accounts. In the video, Mr. Trump conceded that he had lost the election and condemns the Capitol attack, two things he had stubbornly refused to do before he was banned from the social media site. This means that Mr. Trump would rather lose his presidency than his posting privileges, which emphasizes the importance of having a voice on social media, and even the President Donald Trump knows this to be fact. Roos continues that no serious thinker believes that Twitter and Facebook, as private companies, are obligated to give any user a platform. Just as no one doubts that a restaurant owner can boot an unruly diner for causing a scene. But there are legitimate questions about whether a small handful of unelected tech executives accountable to only their boards and shareholders, and in Mr. Zuckerberg's case to neither, should wield such enormous power. These actions also raise longer-term questions, such as whether the business models of social media companies are fundamentally compatible with a healthy democracy, or whether a generation of Twitter-addicted politicians can ever be untaught the lesson that racking up retweets is a surer path to power than governing responsibly. Social media companies are corporations and act in their own interests, not in the interests of the people. This is a standard that must be changed because of the intrinsic applications of social media in our everyday life and in politics. Thus, we affirm.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. Now we go to team two for the negative.
Before we start, can everyone hear me clearly? Okay. On January 6, 2021, we saw the grave consequences of politicians using reckless speech on social media platforms. In an attempted insurrection at the US Capitol, a violent extremist mob attacked our elected government, attempting to overthrow the results of the presidential election. During this attack, 5 people lost their lives. As a result, the sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump, was banned from various social media platforms. And let us be abundantly clear, Trump was not banned due to his political viewpoints, but rather because he used social media platforms to incite violence and spread misinformation, repeatedly violating the policies of the social media sites. Before we go any further, we would like to clarify what we are debating today and whether social media companies can ban users solely based on their political viewpoints. Banning users for inciting violence, reckless speech, and violating terms of use agreements is not relevant to the resolution, and passing this type of legislation could blur the lines and make it harder for social media platforms to regulate this type of objectionable speech. Although we do not believe that there are any prominent examples of users being banned for expressing political views in recent history, we argue that social media companies should retain their right to dissociate from speech that they find unacceptable. Further, we argue that the government passing legislation to prevent social media companies from banning users as they see fit would actually be strong government overreach that results in the state censoring social media and the speech shared on these platforms. To ensure that we're all on the same page, we would like to discuss a few definitions relevant to the resolution. First, we understand legislation to be laws passed by our government, and in this case, the federal government. Social media companies include online platforms whose sole purpose is to connect users in social behavior, whether that's sharing posts, discussing content, or interacting in groups. Banning users refers to disallowing certain people from engaging in use of the online platform, and usually permanently. Finally, political viewpoints is the expression of an opinion related to politics. Political viewpoints do not include hate speech, calls to violence, harassing or derogatory language, or misinformation. And I think we can agree that those types of posts are grounds for removal, regardless of the political opinions of the poster. In negating the resolution that legislation should be passed to disallow social media companies from banning users based on political viewpoints, we are arguing that no legislation should be passed, and that social media companies should retain their right to ban users from their platform as they see fit. To support our position, we have 3 contentions. First, such legislation would be government overreach. Second, social media companies are not government public forums. And third, social media sometimes needs to act quickly to remove posts that could cause harm, and legislation that could make it harder just to do that. So let's walk through each one. Our first contention is that passing such legislation would be government overreach. The government stepping in to disallow social media companies from banning users based on their political viewpoints would be stripping these companies of their First Amendment rights to dissociate with speech that they dislike. Further, such legislation would be unconstitutional as related to Citizen United versus Federal Election Commission Supreme Court decision in 2010 that stated that corporations, including social media companies, can participate in politics because to rule otherwise would be a restriction of their freedom of association guaranteed by the First Amendment. Further, such legislation would allow the state to decide which associations have political participant rights and which do not, and in effect, passing this legislation would be a violation of the first speech rights. Second, social media companies are not free and open forum, and social media companies should therefore be able to ban users that they see fit. For example, prominent politicians such as Donald Trump and Lauren Boebert had blocked US citizens from viewing or interacting with their accounts. If politicians argue that they can block the public from participating in discussion with them in an online forum, social media companies are not representative of a public forum where politicians must be available to all constituents. Social media companies are private companies that host community forums and are therefore not subject to any sort of requirements that would prevent them from banning users based on their political viewpoints. As Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas states in his opinion for the Biden versus the Knight First Amendment institution at Columbia University, it seems odd to say that something is a government form when a private company has unrestricted authority to do away with it. Finally, our third contention is that social media companies need to retain their full authority to ban users quickly and without interference from the government. According to the Internet Live Stats Twitter usage statistics, every second there's about 6,000 tweets that are shared on Twitter. And that's 500 million posts a day just from one social media company alone. Most posts are harmless, but some can be dangerous and insightful, and sharing content that is illegal or organizing violent acts. Social media companies manage a wealth of information and data, and in instances where posts or users need to be banned to prevent harm from occurring, they need to be able to do it quickly. On January 6, 2021, during the attack of the US Capitol, many insurrectionists were taking their cues and acts on the tweets sent by President Trump, according to New York University School of Law, Mary McCord, former acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the US Department of Justice. Social media companies need to act quickly to remove these posts and ban the users to prevent further violence from occurring. Employing additional government barriers to this action by introducing questions of whether removing these posts would be legal is irresponsible. So due to these three arguments, we strongly negate the resolution that legislation should be passed and would disallow social media companies from banning users based on their political viewpoints. Our opponents may have argued that bans would be a violation of free speech, but we have successfully demonstrated that this argument does not apply to social media companies, which are privately held and run. And we agree that with our opponents that the social media companies hold a tremendous amount of power in regards to speech, but the solution is not to enact legislation that prevents social media companies from regulating their own platforms. This legislation is government censorship masquerading as support of free speech. True free speech is not regulated by the government. And in conclusion, passing legislation to disallow bans would be irresponsible overreach by our government, and social media companies should retain the right to dissociate with speech that they find objectionable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those opening statements and for laying out your views so clearly. So now we move into the second round, which is a cross-examination in which the teams can respond to one another and to questions from the moderators. So I will kick us off. And again, judges, if you have questions, feel free to post them to me in the chat. The first thing that I would like to hear a little bit more reflection on from both teams is this question of how we define social media companies. Are they private businesses or are they public utilities? And I feel like I heard pieces of definitions from both of you, but it feels to me like this is pretty central to the question. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in that regard.
Yeah, if I may answer that first. I think that's a great question, and it's really central to our argument and our cases here. I think Benna and I would argue that they are private entities that provide a public platform, and as such, there exists a unique intersection, and that is what our case rests on, that when when such legislation is passed, it imposes on the executive boards of these companies, which would treat them as private entities. But the fact that they are public platforms that provide just a space for discourse, right? And that's what we're arguing, a space for free discourse where people are comfortable sharing their political viewpoints. It makes it a very complicated issue. But thank you for asking that.
And if I might add, these companies are private as they stand, but that's not to say that like being private doesn't mean that you're not subject to regulation by the government. You can still be a private corporation and have to face some repercussions for your actions and have a sort of standard set by the government.
Nitu, do you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so in our opinion, because social media companies are a private platform, they're not subject to a lot of these regulations or subject to being forced to display speech on their platforms that they may disagree with. And we believe that there's a lot of precedent with Supreme Court rulings throughout the years that would support this idea. For example, there's two cases that I can refer to now: Lloyd Corp versus Tanner in 1972, and then Pruneyard Shopping Center versus Robbins in 1980. Very similar cases, both affirm the idea that just because being shopping centers in this case were open to the public, it did not turn them into public forums that were governed by the First Amendment. And I think this argument can be applied really readily to social media companies. Simply because they are open to the public does not mean that they are government forums and should be subject to this special regulation. Private governance of speech is generally preferred to public governance of speech in these cases. And then another case that we can refer to, Building Industry Association of the Bay Area versus City of Oakland. It was a Ninth Circuit decision in 2018. This case was about the City of Oakland requiring new buildings to display public works of art that were approved by the City of Oakland. The court ruled that this was a violation of the company's First and Fifth Amendments rights, because the government cannot force property owners or developers to engage in an expressive activity that they may disagree with. And I think this argument can also be translated to social media platforms. Because they are private companies, they should not be forced to display or engage or associate with speech that they disagree with, and should be allowed to dissociate with any speech that they find objectionable.
Can I remark on the first case, the supermarket case? I think that that's true. Like the government can't tell, or these supermarkets can't necessarily, or they can refuse service to pretty much anyone as long as they're not discriminating against a protected class. That's exactly what this social media argument would do, or this resolution would do, is it wouldn't disallow social media companies from banning people if they're violent or if they're causing a ruckus. It would ban them, it would disallow them from banning them if they have a specific political opinion solely. That's the same thing as not being able to ban someone from a supermarket for being a specific race or a specific sexuality. That's not protected. And additionally, when you talk about the right to association, I think that there are a lot of different views on Twitter right now. I don't think that Jack Dorsey endorses all of the views on Twitter right now by any means. So I'd argue that it's different. It's not that they're associating. No one thinks that the CEOs of Twitter are associating with all of the things that are going on with Twitter. The freedom of association is a little bit different in this case, just looking at it logically.
And just to add to that, just bouncing off the question that was posed by the moderator, it's important to separate the utility of something and who runs something. So like we said, even though they are private companies run by private individuals, it's important to see them as platforms that promote civil discourse, right? And as our definitions state, we are in favor of civil discourse by making concessions for violent or inciting speech or just blatant falsities.
So it seems like the question of what type of speech is coming up, and specifically the issue of inciting speech. And I was really interested that in both of your opening statements, both affirmative and negative, you both really honed in on Twitter and some of the recent challenges around President Trump and the January 6th insurrection and so on. But I wondered if you could speak to how we might make sense of some of those concerns around where speech can shift into incitement on other types of social media platform, right? What about something like Pinterest, for example? And I'm thinking of the recent coverage of the mass shooting by a white supremacist, where one of the things that came up in media coverage of that event was that this person had been thrown off a My Little Pony fan site, right? And then I learned all these things about how fan sites for something as that would seem to me totally non-political as a children's show and a children's toy, where the speech implications and the political implications might lie. So I wondered if you could try and speak to some of those issues a little bit, where it's less clear where is the politics, where is the incitement, but maybe those things are there. What are the responsibilities in those types of cases?
For this, Benna, would you like to take this, or is it okay if I take it? Okay, thank you. For this, we would like to harken back to the Brandenburg test that speaks about inciting speech. So the Brandenburg test lays out two conditions for something to be categorized as inciting speech, which is speech that is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and speech that is likely to incite or produce such action. Now, yes, we do concede that on social media platforms, just because of association and just because people are still behind a screen, right? It is difficult to tie things together. But as we saw in the case of President Trump, former President Trump, that there was clearly a promotion of violent acts, right? And there were clear ties that we could see. And in those cases, public safety is at risk. There's damage to life and property. And our definition, as Benna, my partner, laid out, does make concessions for that.
To respond, I think we agree with the affirmative that there are a lot of risks to these posts happening on social media, which is why we think that the social media companies themselves should retain the power to ban users as they see fit. Taking back to the example of President Trump, as the affirmative mentioned, can we imagine if the government had been in charge at that time of deciding if his posts were acceptable or not, and whether they should be removed? We just don't think the government has the authority, or that's not their place to decide what constitutes political viewpoints, what constitutes objectionable political viewpoints, and what should be removed. And that's really what we're discussing at this point, is this legislation will take that power from social media companies and put it in the hands of the government to regulate that speech. And we think that's a terrible precedent to set, really, for the government being in charge of deciding what is or is not objectionable speech. We know that trust in our government is pretty low. We know a Pew Research poll in 2020 said that just 20% of US adults say they trust the government to do the right thing just about always or most of the time. So we know that our government isn't always capable of making these decisions, and leaving that power in their hands could lead to some pretty devastating consequences.
I think that the net is being a little misleading here, in that they're making it seem like these social media companies are the people. They're these big groups, like lots of different ideas and opinions, but that's not what's going on, right? It's like 3 CEOs that can make any decision that they want. They can be swayed by people that pay them. They can be swayed by their board. But that, in contrast, the government is people that we elect. The government is the people, right? Like it's very, very different from the world that the negative is painting. The government is a much better regulatory body than a few CEOs that are regulatory, or that are regularized, that experience regulation by themselves. Like they're the ones regulating themselves. And in turn, that's no regulation at all.
And just to add to that, if I may, what the response from the negative was sounded very self-defeating. It's very self-defeating to separate politics from the government, because that's essentially what the government is. And as my partner stated, that the government, they comprise of elected representatives. So there's not just one side that's being reflected by the government and by elected officials, but there are many viewpoints. And that's why impeachment trials were held against the former president, right? Because government officials found that his behavior was problematic. It's also important to know that it's a very cynical viewpoint to think that the government is less invested in its people's values and its people's benefit. And also it's important to acknowledge, like Benna said, that corporates and CEOs of social media companies have vested interests that lie in profit maximization.
If I may, I'll take a second to respond to that. So I think, like the social media CEOs that have vested interests, so do politicians who are in office and elected. This legislation that's been proposed, one of the acts that's been proposed, the Ending Support for Internet Censorship Act in 2019, the proposal was that a regulatory board would be appointed by Congress and the White House that would review the social media platforms in regard to how they are banning or censoring posts on their platforms. I think this creates a really perverse incentive for elected officials to cozy up with these social media platforms. These elected officials, yes, they're elected. They're elected in the House every 2 years and the presidency every 4 years. And so whoever's in power at that time would have ultimate control at the narrative that's appearing on these social media sites. And I think that's a really dangerous precedent to set, where we're giving, whoever's in power at the time complete control to set the narrative for what people are seeing on these social media platforms. Yes, it might not be ideal for these social media companies with as much power as they have, for the CEOs to have control of this, but do we want our government who has this incentive to set the narrative so they can retain power over time to set that narrative? I don't think that's a better solution.
I think it is, because I think that social media companies are inherently one group of people, inherently one CEO, one board of investors. But the government is inherently all of these different political opinions. If you have a regulatory board made by the government, it's not going to be the president, right? It's not going to be one guy who is in power, as you say, right? It's a bunch of different elected people. Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, they never got your vote, right? They were just put into place as people that can control whatever you say. And this is really damaging in the future. Like right now, they're not really banning like minority views all the time, but who's to say that they can't do that later, right? Who's to say that Jack Dorsey feels really strongly about a political opinion and decides to ban a bunch of users who have that political opinion? That's totally allowed. And I think that there must be protection to protect minority groups from that, and to protect all of us from that. There needs to be that safeguard.
Just to tack on to that, the government actually is accountable to the people, right? But social media CEOs aren't. Their transparency laws or their transparency policies aren't as strong as the government's. And well, they don't run the test of election, like you said, every 2 years and 4 years for the houses and the president. CEOs will be in place, but if the government acts in a way that the people feel is not to their benefit, then there is the whole election process that makes sure accountability is held and transparency is held.
I don't think your mic is on if you're saying something.
Oh, yes, thank you. I was asking if the negative team wanted to respond, or whether we wanted to throw out a follow-up question.
Sure. So I think When we talk about social media not being accountable to the people that that are using these platforms, I think that's a little oversimplified. They are accountable in respond to what the people that are using these platforms want. If these social media companies do something that the people using them do not like, if they don't agree with the social media company's terms of use or whatever they're doing, they can dissociate from that platform and use another platform. We've seen that. The affirmative has brought up a couple of examples of that, where if people don't like what's going on Twitter, maybe they move to Parler instead. And so I think ultimately these social media platforms are accountable in the same way, just that they have to respond to the wants and the needs of the people that are using them, because that's ultimately who is making the money for these platforms.
And to also add to that, the affirmative is saying that the social media companies is just run by a select group of people. There is an elected board of directors that play, and shareholders do play account on that. The public does. And also to say that we shouldn't be focusing on a slippery slope. The legislation shouldn't be so reactionary to what is going on.
We were having some tech problems there, so if those continue, we might have to move into our backup room. I hope not. Thank you. I mean, this is a rich discussion. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more from both the affirmative and the negative teams about what you think the current options are outside of banning users. We're talking about the need for legislation, and I think, to me, related to that question is what are the options that support civility and respect and safety on platforms, on social media platforms, without banning?
I'm glad you asked that, and if my opponents are okay, is it okay if we take this first? Thank you. There are actually regulations in place that exist in the status quo. For example, on any Instagram post that speaks about COVID, whether it's the vaccine or testing, Instagram does put up this warning that directs you to the CDC website, right, with current COVID guidelines. And we believe that that is more helpful than an outright ban, because not only does it kind of alert people to this information being a possible falsity, but actually directs people to the right resources from credible credible authorities, right? And then you also have community guidelines in place. So a social media site will take down your post automatically if it violates certain community guidelines that are delineated. And we believe that these options and more that could be put in place are more beneficial than outright bans, because an outright ban sends a certain message of censorship, of curbing of free speech that we believe is problematic.
And just to respond, I think we agree with the affirmative. These are also really great solutions and could solve a lot of these issues of kind of like the echo chambers or the misinformation that's occurring on social media platforms. I think that's a great point. I think what we're arguing on the negative, though, is that this legislation that would regulate social media companies and that would kind of control the speech that can or cannot be on these platforms should not be passed. The government should not be stepping in to tell the social media companies what can and cannot be on these platforms. And I think that's kind of the distinction is, yes, these are also great solutions. And we at the same time as those can be implemented, we also believe legislation should not be passed that would give government power to regulate the speech on these social media platforms. I think on the surface, this legislation seems like a great idea, but really, I think it sets the precedent for government regulating speech. It sets the precedent for the government deciding which associations can have political viewpoints and which associations can dissociate from views that they may find objectionable. So today it's social media. Tomorrow, what other associations can no longer dissociate from speech that they find objectionable? So I think we agree with the affirmative on a lot of points. We don't think that this legislation is a great idea, and the government should not be stepping in and getting involved here.
Sorry, an important question was raised in the chat that I think really helps push forward some of our conversation, perhaps, because we've been focusing a lot on the federal government. And a question was asked, if the federal government doesn't regulate social media platforms, then individual states could attempt to regulate them, and therefore, what would that mean for users in certain states versus others? And what does it mean for private companies under different regulatory structures? So could both the affirmative and the negative discuss this issue of what state level regulation could mean?
That's actually quite an interesting question because, there are different contextual problems in different states. And I think it's very defeating to just the function of social media being a platform that provides, global communication or just national communication even, right? If we're limiting ourselves to the United States, if one state has certain policies that look at certain political viewpoints as objectionable and another state does not, it kind of creates this disparity and kind of creates problems within national communication. And I think it's especially important in the world we live in right now, that's plagued by COVID, to have this communication across state boundaries to allow people on social media to share their experiences. And if we were to decide between state governments and the federal government, it would just be less problematic for the federal government to pass a blanket legislation, to avoid the problems that I just stated.
I think this question it's very interesting, and I think it would be very messy for states to regulate individually the social media platforms. But I think you can step back and say the same thing. The US government at the national level, if they were to regulate these social media platforms, what does that mean for Americans in the context of global communication? So I think this argument applies not only to the state level, but then also, yes, this legislation that we're discussing at a federal level would put Americans at a disadvantage in the fact that their government would be stepping in to regulate this platform. And I think that would get messy with the global implications of social media.
I want to remark that I think that American companies, American social media companies, it would probably be a global impact, probably if something is taken down or banned off of an American-owned social media site, I just kind of would assume that it would be taken down in total. So I don't think it leads to a disadvantage. And I think other countries have a similar systems like that, and I don't necessarily think that that's something that leads to intrinsic harms.
Could I just ask a clarifying question on what one of the judges just posted in the chat? Is that okay? Would they just be able to rephrase this, so what they mean by other governments and what particular definition of incitement they're talking about?
Yeah, I think I'm reading the question. I'm reading the question as a response to the point that was just introduced about how global governance would also impact. And so the question is, when non-US governments, especially those without democratic systems and more authoritarian systems, would legislate American media companies, how does that affect the position that you're each presenting here?
Sorry, Benna, you can go ahead.
I think just kind of what I just said, I think that American companies would probably be bound by the American federal government's laws, and each country would kind of be the regulatory body of their own social media companies, as I think is probably the status quo when private companies exist in certain companies.
And just to add to that, yes, different governments, across the globe have certain political viewpoints that they push, right? But it's also important to note that governments are accountable to their people, that governments across the world do want to prevent major damage to life and property, and that's something that they keep in mind while forming laws regarding incitement.
Negative team, did you want to briefly address that point about global governments?
Sure, and very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, but I think this is kind of harkens back to the argument that we've been trying to make, is just that, you know, the government, when we give them this much power, there is a tendency or a possibility that it results in kind of an authoritarian control of the narrative, and that's what we're trying to avoid in avoiding this legislation.
Okay, well, thank you for that very rich discussion. That concludes round 2. And now we move into our final round, which is closing statements. And each team have 5 minutes. I need to reset the timer. I put 6 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes to conclude your arguments. And again, we'll start with the affirmative team. So over to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank everyone in this debate for their participation, and the moderator and the judges. I'd like to start off with a very telling quote about free speech. When the city of, in a case concerning the city of Chicago versus Terminello, they asserted that a function of free speech under our system of government is to invite dispute, stir people to anger, and have profound unsettling effects as it presses for acceptance of an idea. And that is really central to this tournament, right? That is central to the tenets of free speech that we are arguing. Free speech and free speech surrounding political viewpoints is meant to unsettle people. It's meant to make them uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to incite violence, which is what our definition makes allowances for, but it just to get them thinking that there are alternative viewpoints to their own, to expose them to different viewpoints. We'd like to stress that our definition in particular makes allowances for circumstances in which speech that incites violence or targets a person with hate speech, or even it makes allowances for protection for users that spread falsities. And what we're talking about is political viewpoints. As they've asserted, there are great dangers in creating filter bubbles and promoting confirmation bias, which in turn promotes partisanship and tribalism, which would upset the current social structure that we live under. Time and again, we have heard the negative talk about the dangers of giving the government a lot of power, but what about the dangers of giving CEOs and social media company boards that much power? Social media company boards, like we stated before, they're corporates, right? They're corporations. They are, I guess they're beholden to profit more than they are to the people. And we would rather that the government, whose function and whose purpose is to frame laws that are beneficial to their citizens, we would rather have them pass these laws. And I think the negative time again failed to recognize that social media companies have vested interests. And it's honestly a very idealistic view to think that social media companies and CEOs and boards don't push for certain political agendas. They aren't answerable to the people who invest in their companies. They aren't answerable to stakeholders and shareholders. Even if you forget 99% of what we talked about in this debate, I think it's important to remember why we emphasize free speech, why it's important, especially in this global world, and just talk about the effects of censorship, the effects that snowball and allow authoritarian policies and authoritarian governments to take hold, but also the idea of e-colonization, of allowing these companies to essentially engage in colonial policies. And for these reasons and more, I would urge the judges to affirm the resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will go to our negative team for their closing statement.
Yeah, so I just want to start off again thanking the affirmative. This was a really interesting and fun debate. And then, of course, our judges for being here today. I think there is a lot that we're agreeing on throughout this debate. For one, social media companies do have a tremendous amount of power and control over the speech that is happening in our country right now. But we do not believe that legislation is the solution to this problem. And we believe that it would actually hurt true free speech that's not regulated by the government. So again, we negate the resolution that legislation should be passed to disallow social media companies from banning users based on political viewpoints. In negating the resolution, we believe, or we are arguing, that no legislation should be passed and that social media companies should retain their right to ban users from their platforms as they see fit. We believe that this type of legislation is really just censorship masquerading as free speech. So let me remind us of the three contentions that were supporting our negation of this resolution. So our first contention was that this legislation would shift censorship from social media companies to the government. We know that trust in our government is very low. Americans have no faith that the government would do the right thing. Maybe social media companies do have too much power, but is the government really in a better position to take hold of that power? We don't think so. Our second contention is that social media companies are really not public forums as defined by Supreme Court precedent, and they should not be forced to publish speech they disagree with. This would be in violation of the First Amendment rights of these associations. Our third contention was that social media needs to retain their full authority to act fast in case of inciting political violence and posts that are inciting violence on their platforms. We don't believe that the politicians who are currently in charge should decide what should or should not be removed. We think that's a slippery slope to authoritarianism. So in conclusion, we believe that this legislation is strong government overreach. It really sets a precedent for the government to regulate free speech and decide what is and is not acceptable. The affirmative is arguing that social media is not accountable in any way. We don't think this is true. If people don't like the platforms, they can move to other platforms. And ultimately, they are accountable to the people who are using the platforms and their shareholders. The affirmative is also arguing that social media cannot be trusted to regulate their own platforms. But again, we ask, should the government be trusted more? Are they in a better position to regulate these platforms? Additionally, Supreme Court precedent and constitutional precedent supports the idea that government intervention in speech is not actually free speech. True free speech is absent of any government regulation, including the government's ability to decide what does and does not constitute political viewpoints. So this legislation would give control to the government. It would give ultimate power for whoever is in charge at the time to control the narrative. We know that private governance in our speech is really valued. We prefer private governance of speech as opposed to government control of speech, which is why we really negate this resolution and oppose this legislation. So in conclusion, in the world of the affirmative, the government really gets to decide what constitutes political views. The government gets to decide which associations have the right to hold political views. And we replace potentially untrustworthy social media regulation with government regulation, which we could argue is maybe even less trustworthy than the social media companies. It would also create perverse incentives for these social media companies to maybe cozy up with the government regulators who are in charge of deciding what does or does not constitute acceptable posts on these platforms. In the world of the negative, we believe that true free speech is not regulated by the government and that this legislation should not be passed. So again, we negate the resolution that legislation should be passed to disallow social media companies from banning users based on political viewpoints. And we believe that no legislation should be passed and that social media companies should retain their right to ban users or dissociate from speech as they see fit. Thank you.
Thank you all. Wonderful job. So that concludes our round 2 Oxford style debate. Thank you, students, for such incredible and rich arguments. Thank you, judges, for your time. And good luck, everyone. Hope to see you all later. Take care.
Yeah, thank you guys for judging the moderator and giving us us here on.
Good luck. Yes, you too.